There's a line George Jung became famous for, repeated in interviews for the rest of his life: "I never gave anybody up." It's the emotional spine of the movie Blow. A smuggler who lost everything but kept his code. Loyalty over freedom. Here's the federal trial transcript. November 1987, Jacksonville, Florida. George Jung, first witness called by the prosecution, sworn in against the man who'd been his prison cellmate, his partner, and by his own account close to a brother in the trade, Carlos Lehder. Hold on to that. The most quoted thing George Jung ever said about himself may be the opposite of what the court record shows he actually did. We're not here to just replay the movie's version of a folk hero. We're here to show you the deal he actually made and why. This is the corrected version of this story. New research surfaced a federal trial transcript that changes the emotional center of the entire narrative, and we think you deserve the update. Quick question before we start. If you found out the man in the movie you thought never talked actually did, would that change how you see him? Comment your answer. George Jacob Jung was born August 6, 1942, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, a working-class town south of Boston. His father, Fred, ran a small heating oil business that never quite worked. His mother, Ermin, left the family more than once over the years. George grew up watching his father work himself toward nothing and made himself a private promise. He was never going to be that broke or that invisible. He played football, graduated Weymouth High in 1961, drifted through a couple of semesters at the University of Southern Mississippi, and in 1967, at 24, headed west to Manhattan Beach, California, with no real plan at all. Nothing in his high school record predicted what came next. He wasn't a troubled kid with a juvenile file. He was an athletic, well-liked, unremarkable teenager, which is worth remembering, because the myth that grew up around him later needed a more dramatic origin story than the one the actual record supports. What he found on that beach was marijuana, cheap and plentiful in California, worth roughly 10 times as much back home in Massachusetts. Jung did the math the way he'd keep doing it for the rest of his working life. Buy low here, sell high 1,500 miles away, repeat. He started small. Suitcases, hollowed-out surfboards, false floors in campers, driven cross-country. By 1968, he'd recruited real commercial flight attendants to carry duffel bags of marijuana onto scheduled flights from LAX to Boston for a few $1,000s a trip, clearing more than that himself in a single afternoon. After connecting with a Mexican supplier, the operation scaled fast. Small planes flying 500 to over 1,000 pounds at a time out of Puerto Vallarta into the California desert. By his own later account, he told himself he was some kind of counterculture folk hero. The more honest version is simpler. He'd found a gap nobody was policing yet, and he was good at exploiting it. It's worth naming what that reframing actually did for him over the following decades. Calling himself a folk hero wasn't just self-flattery, it became the narrative foundation for everything that followed, including the eventual memoir and film. A greedy opportunist who found a gap in enforcement is a much less marketable story than a countercultural rebel sticking it to the establishment. He understood, even in his 20s, which version of himself would sell better. In 1974, he was arrested at Chicago's airport carrying roughly 660 pounds of marijuana, skipped bail, was caught again months later, and in March 1974 walked into Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. At Danbury, Jung met a young Colombian-German inmate doing time on minor smuggling and stolen car charges, Carlos Lehder. By multiple accounts, Lehder was volatile, obsessive about Adolf Hitler's writing on one hand, worshipful of John Lennon on the other, contemptuous of America, while completely fixated on American money. For roughly a year and a half sharing that cell, Jung taught Lehder what he knew about American smuggling logistics: radar gaps, small airport bribery, weight distribution on a loaded plane. Lehder told Jung something that changed the entire trajectory of both their lives. In Colombia, a kilo of cocaine wholesaled for a few $1,000s. In the United States, that same kilo could sell for tens of thousands. Picture the actual mechanics of that partnership forming, because it's a genuinely strange origin story for one of the largest smuggling networks of the era. Two men sharing a small federal prison cell, sketching supply routes and profit margins on legal pads, the way business partners might draft a plan at a kitchen table. Neither one needed a criminal underworld connection to get started. They needed a shared cell, 16 months, and complementary skill sets. One man who understood American logistics, one man who understood where the product actually came from. They were released in 1975 and 1976. Within about a year, they had a real operation running cocaine from Colombia through the Bahamas into South Florida, and Lehder had begun building something nobody in the trade had attempted at that scale before, a private, fortified transshipment island. Lehder bought out or pressured off nearly every resident of Norman's Cay, a small Bahamian island roughly 210 miles from the Florida coast, and built a refueling strip, a hangar, and a radar tower, turning it into one of the most effective cocaine transshipment points in the history of the trade, reportedly with the cooperation of bribed local officials. Jung's role, according to the most carefully sourced modern account of his case, was concentrated in the earlier logistical phase of the partnership: aircraft procurement, drop coordination, the initial small-scale runs. Once Lehder's independent Norman's Cay operation matured between roughly 1978 and 1981, the two men's partnership effectively wound down. This is also where the most disputed claim in Jung's entire story lives. Popular retellings, including Jung's own later interviews, describe a direct personal relationship with Pablo Escobar, visits to Escobar's estate, a nickname, El Americano, even Jung witnessing Escobar personally execute someone. Some of Jung's own later interviews go further still, describing having to seek Escobar's permission before he agreed to testify against Lehder. We're presenting both sides plainly because that's genuinely where the record sits. A famous, oft-repeated personal story from the man himself on one side, a documentary paper trail that doesn't corroborate it on the other. Make of that gap what you will. It's a pattern that shows up more than once in this story. It's worth naming why this particular dispute matters more than most of the uncertain details in this series. Jung's entire post-prison public identity, the interviews, the memoir, the persona the film immortalized, rested heavily on his proximity to Escobar specifically. If that proximity is thinner than claimed, it doesn't erase what Jung actually did. It does suggest that even the man's own account of his career carried the same instinct for self-mythologizing that shaped his folk hero framing of the marijuana years. Around 1977, Jung met Mirtha Jung, Cuban-born, raised partly in Colombia. They married that year, and on August 1st, 1978, their daughter was born, Christina Sunshine Jung. For a brief window, by every account, Jung had all of it at once: money, a family, and standing inside one of the most dangerous trafficking networks in the hemisphere. It didn't hold. Both parents developed serious drug habits through the following years. Their relationship grew violent and unstable, playing out in a household increasingly full of armed men and mounting paranoia, with a young daughter growing up in the middle of it. Mirtha filed for divorce in 1984. Christina was 6. She and her father would remain largely estranged for close to 3 decades afterward. By 1984, Lehder had fled into Colombia as Bahamian authorities, under heavy American pressure, finally moved on Norman's Cay. Jung, meanwhile, was arrested again on separate smuggling charges out of Florida and facing what he later described as a 70-year sentence. According to his own later account, prosecutors approached him in 1985 about testifying against Lehder, 2 full years before Lehder was ever captured. Jung initially refused. He agreed only after Lehder himself, facing his own capture, had already written to Vice President George H.W. Bush offering to cooperate against the very network Jung and Lehder had built together. Lehder was captured in Colombia in February 1987, extradited, and tried in Jacksonville, Florida. Jung testified as the prosecution's first witness, beginning November 17, 1987. Under oath, he described the operation in granular detail, moving cocaine from Colombia to Massachusetts, repacking shipments in a Miami Beach hotel room, Lehder's mother once personally delivering 8 kilograms hidden in luggage to a Los Angeles apartment. Lehder was convicted on all counts in May 1988 and sentenced to life without parole plus 135 years. Jung's cooperation reduced his own sentence considerably. Reporting on the case describes his term dropping from a 60-year exposure down to roughly 20 years actually served. Sit with the gap between that transcript and the line Jung would spend the rest of his life repeating to reporters: "I never gave anybody up." By the court's own record, the first major thing he did after his cocaine partnership collapsed was take the stand against the man at the center of it. It's worth being precise about what that reveals. because it's not simply a matter of Jung telling one lie for decades. Cooperation deals in federal cases are almost always kept quiet by the cooperating party once the sentence reduction is secured, admitting to it damages, standing in exactly the circles that make a post-prison memoir and film career profitable. Jung had every practical incentive to let the loyalty myth stand uncorrected, and by all appearances, he did so for the rest of his life, across dozens of interviews, without ever volunteering the transcript that told a different story. Jung kept moving smaller loads through the following years, working older contacts on a shrinking scale as the cartel's supply lines shifted toward Mexican pilots who no longer needed a Massachusetts middleman. In 1994, DEA agents tracked him through Topeka, Kansas, on one final run carrying roughly 1,750 pounds of cocaine, and arrested him without incident. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy. The judge handed down 60 years. He served his time primarily at Otisville Federal Correctional Institution in New York, 20 years, much of it while a movie about his life turned him into a minor celebrity he could only experience through letters and prison visits. In 2001, Blow was released, with Johnny Depp visiting Jung in prison to prepare for the role. Whatever the film compressed or softened about the trafficking itself, multiple people close to the case, including Jung himself, singled out one thing it got painfully right: his daughter's absence. The film's ending imagines an older Jung picturing a prison visit from Christina that, for most of his incarceration, never actually came. For years, she refused contact, raised by relatives, wanting nothing to do with the cocaine cowboy the newspapers loved writing about. That part wasn't Hollywood embellishment. That was simply what was still true when the cameras rolled. Jung was released from Fort Dix Federal Correctional Institution in June 2014, 71 years old, broke, and bound by strict parole conditions. He moved into a San Diego halfway house, gave paid interviews, wrote a memoir called Heavy, and slowly, painfully, began rebuilding contact with Christina. Photographs from 2014 show them together for the first time in decades. He met his grandson for the first time around then as well. He violated parole in 2016, served a brief return to custody, and was released for good in 2017, moving back to Weymouth, the town he'd spent his whole life trying to leave. He died in hospice care on May 5th, 2021, at 78 of liver and kidney failure. Christina now runs a small clothing line named, in part, after her father's old nickname. There's something worth sitting with in how that final decade actually played out beyond the individual dates. A man whose entire adult identity had been built around scale, the biggest shipments, the highest volumes, a nickname that made newspapers, spent his last years signing autographs for a couple $100s at true crime conventions, slowly rebuilding a relationship with a daughter who had every reason not to let him back in. That's a genuinely different shape of story than the film's closing images suggest, and arguably a more honest one about what actually happens after an empire like his collapses. Here's what Blow got right: the rise, the scale of the marijuana into cocaine pipeline, the Danbury partnership with Lehder, and, most importantly, the part that actually seemed to matter most to Jung himself: the true, years-long absence of his daughter. That emotional core holds up against the record better than almost anything else in the film. Here's what it changed, and it's the correction this whole episode is built around. The film's Diego Delgado character, the Colombian partner, whose betrayal helps end Jung's career, is a composite drawn from several real figures, not a single traitor. And the film's implicit moral framing, built around a man who lost everything but never broke his code, sits uneasily next to a federal courtroom transcript showing Jung is the prosecution's own lead witness against his former cellmate and partner. That doesn't necessarily make him a villain for testifying. Federal cooperation deals are how organizations at this scale usually actually get dismantled, and this channel isn't in the business of moralizing about a system designed to work exactly that way. It does mean the myth of unbroken loyalty that Jung spent his post-prison decades cultivating in interview after interview doesn't match the document with his own sworn name on it. The man who told the world he never gave anybody up was, provably, the first man the government called to the stand. Next case file is already in the works. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.